Hello, welcome to Unit 2. Glad you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about nonprofit governance structure and different kinds of nonprofits. It's going to be an interesting conversation, so stay tuned. First, wanted to connect with you about course progress and how the schedule is going. As I mentioned, we're looking at different sectors of the nonprofit world. We're also going to look a little bit at understanding markets. The chapters that were assigned for this week for reading for everyone include the Crutchfield and Grant book, chapters 3 and 4. So hopefully you've enjoyed those readings. Those ones are really interesting, and I'm excited to talk about them a little bit more here at the end of the lecture. And then Powell and Bromley, chapters 9 and 10. These these chapters are dense, and yet they're really helpful in understanding social service organizations, in understanding the relationship between nonprofits and specifically government organizations. That's a big part of what chapter 9 especially is about. And again, those readings are for graduate students only, the Powell and Bromley chapters 9 and 10. While everyone has been reading Crutchfield, Grant, and Grant chapters 3 and 4. All right. Assignments for this week. You're probably getting into the rhythm of this from Unit 1, but you have the instructor lecture video, which is this here. The group presentation. So this is new. Last week, Group 1 submitted their presentation on a chapter from this week, and you get to tune into that. So that's wonderful. And the idea behind those is that it's a way of engaging with the material for groups and for you to be able to embody the material, be able to really kind of understand it, and then share that with your classmates. So those group presentations are a really good way of hearing the material from a different perspective. And I encourage you to look at that for this week. So the presentation from Group 1 is now listed on Unit 2 of the Canvas site. You can watch it there. And as a note here, as I'm saying that, I'm realizing that some of you may be watching this when it opens up 2 weeks before the assignments are due. And if that's the case, then the group presentation won't be available until a week before this assignment is due, right? So the items from Group 1, their presentation really won't be available until January 19th because that's their due date. So if you're working ahead and doing work a few weeks ahead, good for you. I'm glad you're doing that, but just be aware that the group presentation might not be up yet. Other assignments, discussion board posts for Unit 2 are due for this week, reading quiz for Unit 2, and then Group 2 is working on their presentation for Unit 3, which will be due here at the end of this week so that everybody can watch it for Unit 3. Yeah? Makes sense? If you ever have questions, please reach out to me and I'm happy to talk with you. All right, let's go into the readings a little bit for this week. This is actually, I really enjoy talking about this subject. So getting more into the structure of nonprofits. Last week, we started with the question, what are nonprofits? And hopefully we answered some of those questions. And I'm curious what you've been seeing as you've been looking around you, seeing the ways that nonprofits interact with your life, thinking about the ways that you interact with nonprofits. I'm curious what your observations have been and what that's been like. I thought I'd start this conversation actually with something that's not directly in the reading, but to give us a little bit more framework when we look at types of nonprofit organizations. So we've asked what are nonprofits, but now maybe we dive a little deeper with the question of what kinds of nonprofits are there out there? And this helps us expand our perspective past what we might be familiar with. For me, I grew up in the context of a lot of religious nonprofits, and that was a lot of the way that I saw the world. And when I thought of nonprofits, I thought of religious nonprofits, or sometimes educational nonprofits. But as I've had more experience in the industry, you begin to see a lot of different kinds of nonprofits, arts and culture nonprofits, nonprofits that are involved in sports and physical education, right? There are a bunch of them, and it can be helpful to have kind of a survey or an overview of that. So this is coming from Indiana University, and it's a small overview of some of the kinds of nonprofit organizations that are out there. Now, even as you dive into this list from Indiana University, there's a lot of like subheadings that I was finding, and I'm like, whoa, you can really kind of dive deep into some of these broad categories. But I'll cover some of them because I think they're helpful for us to be talking about and to be understanding that there are a lot of different kinds of nonprofits out there. So, um, and some of these terms may not be fully similar to you, like there are fully familiar to you. There are some kinds of sectors that go by multiple names, but these are some broad categories. So things like arts and culture nonprofits, right? So this includes things like the visual arts, museums, performing arts organizations. Maybe your local theater company is structured as an arts and culture kind of nonprofit, right? And they may accept donations. They often have volunteers who are acting in them, things like that. You'll also have sometimes historical societies will fall into this group, right? If a historical society is operating a museum or a small in my hometown, there was a really small museum that was operated by a local historical society. Arts and service activities and organizations are also a part of this. There's in Pittsburgh, I think it is it Pittsburgh Glass? That's a nonprofit organization. I don't know if anyone's familiar with them that does a lot of nonprofit and education work around the arts and around specifically glassmaking. So really kind of interesting the sorts of organizations you can find when you start looking. So arts and culture nonprofits and some of the challenges that arts and culture nonprofits face. One of the big ones that comes to my mind happened during the pandemic. And in the pandemic, everything was falling apart, right? And there was a phrase that really became the bane of arts and culture organizations, and it was this idea of essential, right? Are you essential? And working in the nonprofit sector during that time was interesting because a lot of funding decisions, a lot of even just culture determining the relevancy of organizations had to do with whether or not the work you were doing was essential. And arts organizations had to make a case for why what they were doing was essential, which is hard when everybody's locked up in a pandemic and worried about their health and about education and making sure kids are going to classes and like the local theater company was maybe dead last on the list of priorities during that time. But many of them were facing kind of existential crises because they'd lost their audience, they weren't able to continue as normal. And so how do you define yourself in a world that's asking for just the things that are essential? And that was challenging. I saw some arts organizations that navigated that really well. Especially, there was one in particular, and I don't want to mention the name because I'm torn on which one it was. But there was an arts organization in Pittsburgh that created these like mobile packets for young people to be able to do certain crafts or arts while they were at home. And I heard a bunch of positive feedback from parents, from guardians, from people who they were saying this is essential, right? I've got kids for the time they're usually in school and they don't know what to do. They're bored, but they feel stuck, and having these packets of crafts and other kinds of engagement with the arts was pretty important. So you have some creativity and ingenuity that happened, but arts and culture often is there are some organizations that really thrive, but sometimes it can be hard to articulate, especially in times that are difficult, why these services are important. And as we all know, like I'm saying this as an artist, as someone who is a musician and has been deeply involved with the arts for most of my career, it's incredibly enriching and it's incredibly important. The arts and culture are, but sometimes it can be hard to articulate that as a nonprofit. And we'll talk more about these kinds of of organizations as we continue to go along. But again, this is kind of just a general overview. You have education nonprofits. So this is another category. Things like Duquesne is a higher education nonprofit. You also have schools that are at the K through 12 level that are nonprofits, libraries, and like adult learning sort of organizations could be in this bucket too. And you'll see a bunch of different models in education. And education is a great example of this because we've talked a little bit about funding models. We did that last week, but education is a fantastic example of this because a lot of these organizations bring in revenue in a way where they charge their clients, they charge students money for attending. Like Duquesne, clearly, many of us pay tuition, but there's also clearly also a nonprofit element to that through scholarships and through kinds of ways of serving populations that might not have access to that education otherwise. So education institutions, we'll talk more about them as we go along. But that's another big bucket. The environment and animal welfare. So these are things like pollution abatement and control services, environmental beautification, natural resource conservation. The list kind of goes on and on. And on the animal side, things like a zoo. My family and I were at the Omaha Zoo a couple weeks ago, and it was really neat to see this whole organization. And it's huge and incredible in terms of the amount of infrastructure that they've built and then the access that you have to animals. I'm always a little torn when I go to a zoo, a little sad for the animals that are there. Sometimes they feel stuck. And then also, they're amazing and they're wonderful to see. But the Omaha Zoo does a great job of seeming to care for the animals, creating an environment where they can be relatively unconstrained. And we had our 1.5-year-old with us during the trip, and she loved looking at, especially, she was really fascinated. I think it was by the fish. We were in the aquarium, and she loved watching those. But you have all kinds of organizations that are working on a big level, like the Omaha Zoo, but also at a small level. Like there are a couple of no-kill animal shelters back in my hometown, and uh, those shelters are doing important work to take care of these animals that maybe families might not want to adopt for whatever reason it is. Another bucket we can move over to is health. Um, the bucket of health in nonprofits is huge. Healthcare is a massive industry, and healthcare is a really fascinating example because it's entangled with both nonprofit and for-profit models. And on either side, it's big business, right? There's a lot of money in health. And and a lot of controversy too. Some of these big nonprofit health organizations contribute so much to the debt or the overall distress of people with medical debt. This is a big issue in our country, and a lot of complicated kind of ethical pieces to it that involve care, but also involve, yeah, again, medical debt and things like that. It's a lot. But when we look at this as a sector, we get some interesting things. And I think it's really fascinating to look at the way that you have a lot of these large nonprofits, which you can look at, especially hospitals, a lot of hospitals and other kinds of big players in the healthcare space. These are nonprofits. And it's, yeah, it's interesting to see the ways that they intersect with for-profit organizations, whether it's drug companies, that would be a big example of a lot of a lot of for-profit organizations that are operating in the health space, um, health insurers, right? And you have these complicated and complex relationships. Some examples of health organizations are hospitals, primary care facilities, rehabilitative medical services, public health programs, general health, and financing for health. There might be small loans for that. Um, Mental health crisis intervention, things like a hotline, alcohol, drug, substance abuse treatment facilities, then things like disease and disorder and medical disciplines, right? Specifically focused organizations. And then medical research is another big bucket for health organizations. One thing I'll mention here is you'll see sometimes some of these organizations have interesting ways of appealing to people. So I remember a few years back, I don't know if anybody remembers the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, when people were dumping these big buckets of ice water over their heads to support uh, ALS research. And it became a cultural phenomenon, right? People latched onto this. And there's something about health organizations that when they're telling their story in a way that's compelling, it has, in some ways, it doesn't struggle with the same set of problems that arts and culture nonprofits do. Very few of these organizations, like the organization that was raising money for ALS research, have to justify whether or not they're essential. It's kind of taken for granted in some ways. But there are definitely other challenges in terms of the complexity of the sector, in terms of the enormous cost that often goes into operating in this sector. And yeah, that's an important one to be thinking of here. And I will say too, the idea of communication is where this class is embedded within the context of the discipline of communication. Health communication is also a really big and emerging place of study for communication. Human service organizations. So this can be things, this is another bucket, things like correctional facilities, legal services, right? Sometimes there's pro bono legal services that will help people navigate the court system. Employment and job related assistance, could be job training, um, uh, agriculture, food, nutrition, housing and shelter, things like Habitat for Humanity, which featured prominently in some of our reading this week, public safety and disaster preparedness, um, and disaster response too. I was reading about a couple of organizations that responded in the wake of all the climate-related disasters in North Carolina, and then now I'm sure responding to the fires that are happening in Los Angeles. These kinds of organizations have to be really nimble and responsive because they're especially organizations that are first responding sort of organizations. They kind of leap into action at the drop of a hat. Youth development and kind of other traditional human services like children's and youth services, social services, uh, care for elderly people, like more of like less medical care, but like basic life sort of care. There's things like international and foreign affairs and national security. That's another bucket, especially like when we look at human rights and advocacy. That could be an area where nonprofits are operating. And then we also have public and societal benefit. This could be organized under like social benefit organizations. So this includes big buckets like community improvement and capacity building, civil rights, social action, advocacy, right? Things like philanthropy and volunteerism and grant making, right? So you have public foundations and private grant making foundations and named trusts and foundations. Um, I will say here, because this is helpful for understanding, oftentimes in the field itself, you're going to have maybe three really big buckets that organizations are lumped into. And at least this has been my experience. And you can break them down much further, like we're doing, and even further than we're doing. But three of the big kind of really four actually, if I'm thinking about it. It's nebulous because it goes back and forth, but there's at least three or four kind of big buckets of nonprofits Um, and they are social service organizations that could include health organizations, direct service organizations, kind of I'm lumping them together broadly, social services or human services, and then arts organizations. And those have different sets of concerns, again, really broad. Then religious organizations, which we'll talk about some more later, which can often operate in arts or in social services, human services, or as like a church or a place of worship, right? But faith-based organizations, and then finally funders, right? So that's this category here, funders. So while social services and human services, and then arts and nonprofits are often directly involved in serving individuals with needs, or providing services. Funders are more interested in funding the work of these nonprofits, right? And there's a lot of different kinds of funders out there. There's large community foundations like the is it the Heinz Endowments, the Pittsburgh Foundation. There's these different kinds of large community organizations that provide grants. It's often in the form of grants to nonprofits for projects that they're working on, for serving a particular need. Uh, and there's a lot of different structures to those grants, a lot of different kind of ways that these funders interact with nonprofits. But the funders themselves are nonprofits, right? So if you give money to one of these funders, and oftentimes they're not doing like broad solicitation of funds. Often they're working with wealthy donors. Sometimes they were founded by a wealthy donor back at the beginning of their history, and now they have a large endowment that they're working with, and they have specific priorities that motivate their grant making. Some of these organizations are really big and really powerful in terms of the impact that they make in a community, even though they might not be immediately visible to you or I, right? And you could start tracing their influence by the things that they fund and the kind of calls that they put out for funding. So often these organizations will put out a call of, hey, we're looking for this. These are our priorities, and this is our criteria for choosing what we're funding, what we're giving grants to, right? Um, yeah. So these organizations have a lot of different ways that they operate, and we'll talk more about them as we go. But it is helpful to think about kind of larger groupings of social services, arts organizations, religious organizations, and funders. Right? All right. And then, kind of continuing our earlier conversation, some other buckets that Indiana University gives us has to do with religion and spiritual development, right? Churches, synagogues, mosques, things like that. And then mutual benefit organizations. That's things like when you have like insurance providers or pension and retirement funds. I think like credit unions might sometimes make that list, right? Hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the kinds of nonprofits that are out there, and there are a lot, clearly. But what you start to see is that there are a lot of different ways of meeting needs in the community. For me, I think I was most exposed to this when I was a fellow at one point at the Forbes Funds, which is a nonprofit. So it's a funder. It falls in that funder category, but it's a kind of a different funder. It has a decent sized endowment. I think last I checked, it was like 30 to $50 million endowment that funds a lot of its operations. But it more than doing grant making. So a lot of big funders are specifically making funding decisions to fund other nonprofits that are doing on the ground sort of work. The Forbes Funds is more focused on building the capacity of nonprofits. So it's less about handing them money and telling them to go do programs or projects, and it's more about helping develop nonprofit leaders, helping to increase the capacity of nonprofits, both in the social service sector, but also in the arts and the humanities. And the way they do this is by they have a couple of different programs, but the one that I was specifically involved in is called Excel, and it's focused on community action and on social movement building. And while I was a part of that, I had the chance to help onboard leaders from over 80 different nonprofits in the Pittsburgh region on into this program where they learned the basics of not just fundraising, but building social movements. How do you help people become excited about nonprofits and to buy in to the mission of a nonprofit? A lot of the things that we were talking about in the Crutchfold and Grant chapters this week. And while I was with the Forbes Funds, it was just so interesting to see an inside view of the kinds of issues that nonprofits help our society navigate, right? I was when COVID hit, I was working at the Forbes Funds, and I remember being on a call with the president of the organization, and I was helping facilitate the call and also listening in. And the call involved some really important people from the city government, the superintendent of Pittsburgh schools, and they were trying to figure out how to respond to this crisis and what the next steps were going to be. And um, our organization was playing the role of facilitating a lot of these conversations. And even as the pandemic progressed, the Forbes Funds hosted a number of calls every week. The organization would bring in an expert or a couple of experts or leaders in community government, city government, county government, and help connect everyone with answers to what was going on. How were we responding to COVID? How were we taking action, right? And that was incredibly helpful to see and to watch the resource that that was for nonprofit leaders and organizations across the community. They even went so far as to later, as things kind of stabilized in the pandemic, they brought in a political consultant, an advocacy consultant who was from Washington, D.C., and who they'd hired to provide insights into what the larger political response was going to be to help connect to advocacy for Pittsburgh nonprofits on a national stage. And it was just fascinating to see all of that. I think for me at Forbes Funds, what I learned the most was the power of collaborations and how working together across sectors and on different projects could really increase the impact of a nonprofit. And I think that's some of what organizations like the Forbes Funds do best. They go in and they serve as a mediator, as a connector. They can bring these different ideas, these different decision makers into the same room together. The Forbes Funds does this through, they have like a biannual conference that they're a part of, and then that they hold for the community. It brings in lots of different nonprofits from all over the sector. And they also do it through programs like Excel. They have a program, I think it's called C3, that works specifically with like smaller communities, um, like different boroughs throughout Pittsburgh, and brings together leaders both in the business, in the government, and nonprofit sectors together to help solve the challenges they're facing. Right, it serves as a facilitator. I remember going into one of those meetings, I think it was maybe for Braddock or another borough in Pittsburgh. And you had these people who were coming to the table sharing their resources, but also their needs. And it was really powerful to see. And that's some of the idea behind chapter 3 when we look at the Crutchfold and Grant chapters. I'm not going to dive too deeply here because I want to save things for the groups that are presenting. But in chapter 3, where they're talking about making markets work, that's a similar idea, this idea of synergy when you partner together. And you can see that in some of the stories that are told in the chapter, especially the Environmental Defense Fund stories with Fred Krupp and his work with McDonald's and third wave environmentalism. It's a fascinating story. If you haven't read it yet, go read it because it's really interesting to see the kind of impact that nonprofits can make when they are committed to working creatively with for-profit organizations. Just fascinating. I do want to make sure there was something from the chapter I want to make sure is covered a little bit, so I'll mention it briefly here. And it's three ways that nonprofits can leverage business in their mission work, which is to one, change business practices like EDF did, the Environmental Defense Fund did with McDonald's, and changing their packaging so that it was more environmentally friendly. It could be recycled, right? That's one way of doing that. You can partner with businesses, doing partnerships like corporate sponsorships or operational alliances. That's a second way of leveraging business. And then a third is to actually run a business yourself as a nonprofit. I think we talked about this a little bit ago last week, where we looked at like the work of Hershey or Newman's Own, and those are some examples of how organizations can benefit from for-profit business activities, right? And then chapter 4 of the Crutchfield and Grant book was on inspiring evangelists. And the story of Jimmy Carter really stood out to me with Habitat for Humanity, how he was a spokesperson, an evangelist for Habitat for Humanity. Hearing the other day, I was driving to work and I heard parts of the memorial service, the state funeral for President Jimmy Carter, and it was moving to see how someone like this can partner with nonprofits and really contribute to real change in the world. So, all right. Thanks for tuning in and talking some more about nonprofit structure with me. I hope you're well. I hope your studying is going well. If you have questions, please reach out. I'm available by email and I'm happy to talk. But otherwise, good luck and we'll check back in at Unit 3.